Thank you, Soren. It's a privilege to be here. And I want to begin by noting a few things. First, thanking Bishop Laverty for his work on Bought with a Price, which I'll reference throughout the talk. I also want to share with you that my knowledge of this comes largely from clinical experience. I haven't done formal research, but I have combed through the literature and tried to pull out what I think is most psychologically relevant and important for understanding this plague. And I'm also indebted to many people who have formed me through the years, and I'd like to mention in particular the late William May, professor and theologian from the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family, who I had the privilege to know and to hear speak often on theology of the body. Also, I should say that so here's Bishop's book. Much of my material also will come from a clinician, Patrick Carnes, who was really at the forefront of doing research on looking at the scourge of pornography, and his International Institute for Trauma and Addiction Professionals. Several books have been published and provide a good framework for understanding this problem. I'll be using the phrase sexual addiction from time to time, but I also wanted to be clear that not everyone who has a problem with pornography necessarily has an addiction per se, and that doesn't diminish at all the manner in which this phenomena of pornography use is ravaging our society. In our time together, I'll attempt to cover 4 areas listed here. And I want to note that this is an uncomfortable topic in many ways, but as Bishop said, and I think he states well, there's a need to have more people aware and vigilant with respect to understanding this problem and some steps that we can take. Statistics suggest that much like abortion, it's rare the person who is not somehow touched by the problem. Whether it's a friend, a relative, a coworker, someone has a son, husband, father, or daughter who is mired in this trap. And we all suffer from the increased base sexualization of society, as Bishop reflects in his work so well. So I encourage you to read, when you have a chance, Bought with a Price. It has a unique way of blending the psychology and spirituality together, which I think really captures some of the very important things that need to be addressed. First, in terms of exploring the problem, we as Catholic Christians don't always have the liberty to choose where we're going to focus our attention. And there's certain issues that are easily avoided, and I think pornography use is one of them. And as Bishop alluded to, also something like sex trafficking. It's a very important and compelling issue in our day and time, but it's one that we really would rather avoid, most of us, just because of the difficulties that seem so monumental. But gone are the days when we can be blissfully unaware of the extent of such problems, and we all need to refocus and try to find a way that we can have a positive impact on our world. When I was reflecting in my work and review of things, how did we get here? I ran across something from St. John Paul II where he stated almost 20 years ago in a language that I think was very sophisticated and very compelling from a psychological perspective. And he said that our culture suffers from a hedonistic mentality, unwilling to accept responsibility in matters of sexuality, and a self-centered concept of freedom which regards procreation as an obstacle to personal fulfillment. And so we're all impacted by this. The Catechism puts the issue of pornography under the heading of offenses against chastity. And as I glanced through that the other day, I noticed that along with the offenses of chastity are listed lust, masturbation, fornication, prostitution, and rape. So pornography is not in pleasant company at all. And I think we need to really take it seriously, because I think as Bishop alluded to, there are ways in which some people want to see this as a non-issue, not a serious matter. But when one considers the statistics that as many as 87% of college males and 31% of females by one study are viewing pornography, we must accept the fact that even if our nieces, nephews, or children are not viewing pornography, then it's very likely that their roommates, boyfriends, or girlfriends are. And so we have to be concerned, in particular, I think, about the youth and where things are headed, and the trending towards earlier and earlier exposure to pornography. So in addition to the teenagers and college students that we're concerned about, we also, as Bishop mentioned, need to be compassionate and understand that there are people who are trapped in this industry. Bishop reviews in his letter that this is a criminal enterprise, and that others have referred to this as a parasitic, secretive industry that hides the trauma that occurs within its ranks. There was a testimony before a Senate committee by a Dr. Marianne Layden, who is the director of sexual trauma and psychopathology at the University of Pennsylvania. And she details how the actors in these pornography films have to be drunk, high, or even go into what we would call clinically a dissociative state to go to work and to perform on these films. And so there's a huge casualty there for the individual person whose dignity is clearly being compromised. But I would add that to the casualty list that there are people, unfortunately mostly men, who find themselves unable to extricate themselves from the material. Not simply a problem of vice, but as I hope to explain, that it becomes a bona fide neuropsychological problem. And the scope of the problem ranges. It can be anything from a periodic viewing of illicit material to those who develop into what would be a full-fledged addiction. And when it gets to that stage, it can have potentially horrific consequences for them and for their families. So as Bishop emphasized, there's an issue of justice here about which we all must be concerned. And we'll focus in particular on the urgent need to protect the precious gift of our children. And as leaders, my hope is that through increased awareness, you'll be able to respond well to any of those people who might be touched by this, who may approach you. And they're looking for truth about this problem. They're looking for an idea of what direction to head and how to approach things. Many in the public have been confused and deceived because of things like the current approach to media that really highlights pornography in many, many different forms and many subtle forms, where people, I think, have become desensitized and see it as sort of a victimless situation. And I'll quote Pope Francis also, who says that no one is saved from this alone or as an isolated individual. God attracts us looking at the complex web of relationships that take place in a human community. So although the particular people who are directly affected by pornography may be a lesser number, I'm going to argue that all of us need to take this seriously because we are all impacted in some way. Bishop in his overview reviewed the myths, so I won't repeat those. But I do want to note that the letter has been in circulation for some time, and that there have been positive commentaries from church leaders, both Catholic and non-Catholic, university presidents, prominent lay leaders, pastors, and particularly important to me, from mental health professionals. And I wanted to highlight a couple of quotes that have been submitted to us in the letter from colleagues of mine in the mental health field, because I think it's important to appreciate just how clearly helpful it is to have this material as a mental health professional. Dr. Peter Klopanis, who's a licensed clinical therapist and the author of a book called The Pornography Epidemic, A Catholic Approach, stated the following. In reference to Bought with a Price, he says, "Altogether, this pastoral letter is an invaluable resource for anyone who wants to understand the pornography epidemic in America and how to address it from a Catholic perspective. Readers will find that the Catholic Church offers many resources for defending against pornography and for living a pure life." Another therapist, Beverly Talkey, author of Healing Your Family Tree, says, "As a family counselor, I frequently see the corrosive impact of pornography on mind, personality, and relationships, feeding what some have now called, quote, the demise of guys in American society, a sort of chronic adolescent state. Bishop Laverty's letter offers liberations not just to dads, husbands, and sons, but to wives and daughters who long for mature, wise men in their lives. This is a great gift to Catholics and non-Catholics alike." And I think her point is an important one there, that the descent into using pornography really is a barrier to flourishing and to healthy development for the human person. And so it's not a mere vice. It's not something that's a boys will be boys kind of phenomenon. It's something that needs to be taken very seriously. So in terms of understanding this problem, I want to emphasize that the reason for the urgency is that there's quite a bit of complexity here. It's not an easily solved problem. What I have on the slide here is a Thomistic-like rendering of the different aspects of the human person. Of the 4 factors listed here, our bodily constitution, our interpersonal nature, our free will, and of course our intellectual abilities, we can see that the interplay results in a serious problem developing because pornography use impacts each of these areas. In Bishop's letter, he summarizes the crux of the dilemma, I think, very well. He states that very often a key factor in one's descent into pornography addiction is a lack of affirmation, acceptance, and trust in one's relationships. An important part of the ascent out then can also be the sharing of the struggle with others, allowing their love and concern to aid in healing. In other words, the motivation to use pornography is a pursuit of feeling of intimacy. Yet the result is always a greater feeling of isolation, which is entirely predictable based on our Catholic theology, where love is understood as arising from making a gift of oneself to others. In contrast, pornography use is something where the focus is entirely on a selfish desire. So the critical points here are a couple. One is that we do need to appreciate how God made us as relational beings, and our interpersonal nature is fundamental to understanding how to beat this plague of pornography. But also to understand that this isn't just about sexuality, and I think people can sometimes be distracted by that and think that this is merely a sexual problem. But I'd like you to think more broadly that it's really a problem of relationships and relationality and our disconnectedness that can be felt from others. There's also other things to consider here. One is that when it becomes habitual, it can impact a person's life in many, many different ways, far beyond most bad habits. And I'll talk more later about how in its modern forms, mainly the phenomena of the internet, pornography can take on this addictive quality that impacts brain chemistry in ways that make it very difficult to combat. So in addition to this interpersonal need that is fulfilled by pornography, although fulfilled in only a partial way, in a way that's ultimately going to lead to greater difficulty, we also have to consider that there's an emotional impact of the use of pornography. And the emotional issues can come about in different ways. First of all, there is this attempt to meet the emotional need for affirmation. And oftentimes people who are mired in the use of pornography will describe how what they really want is closeness and affection and connection with another person in their life. That's not available, and so they're trying to get this need met through viewing of these images. And as I was describing, that's a dead end. It doesn't work, and people end up feeling empty, and unfortunately, this is how it spirals into more and more use. There's also evidence that depression is a huge part of this problem. And it's probably a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, but you can get into people who are trying to distract themselves from the sadness and the depression in their life, and they're using the pornography to try to self-medicate that. Again, the utility is very short-lived. It doesn't work very well or for very long, but this is one of the phenomena that clients will describe. And also there's an anxiety impact to it, that people will use pornography, they say, as a way of coping with stress and anxiety. They're overwhelmed with life. They're looking for an escape. And again, as Bishop described, in years past, if you wanted a pornographic escape, you had to go to the other side of town, a dark alley, a back room, and people just wouldn't venture there. They would pull back. But now that it's available in the home and privately, it's quite a bit more of a problem. Still others will describe how they've gotten stuck in pornography because of what I would describe as a cognitive problem. They've begun to distort reality in a certain way. They've distorted their interior systems of motivation and reward because they've been using it for so long. And as Bishop mentioned, starting in early teens is not uncommon, that they no longer see what is truly good and right, and they get confused by this. And what complicates it even further is the secretive nature of the pornography use. Another point I'd like to make is that all these pathways must be seen in the context of the person's history. And as a clinician, I get a window into this that perhaps others don't often do. But it's long been known that people who find themselves trapped in the dilemma of pornography abuse have been wounded themselves. Some of the early studies said over 80% of people who identified as sex addicted had been sexually abused as children. Over 70% had been physically abused. And almost everyone would say they were emotionally abused in their family life. So again, there can be a tendency when you hear the word pornography to think that this is purely a sexual problem. But I think we need to broaden our lens and understand that it's not merely a sexual problem, but it's also really a deeply embedded relational problem, has everything to do with families and family lives, and we're not going to conquer this problem and move forward as a society in our communities unless we pay good attention to how to heal some of the problems in our families. I share this piece in part because there can also be this tendency to think that pornography use is the stereotypical dirty old man kind of problem, and that the kind of people who are getting involved in this are of a certain sort. But again, what I see coming into my office is would probably be surprising to you how common and typical the people who are presenting for help with this issue. There's also a sense I get in my dialogue with others of, how can we have compassion for someone who's stuck in this? Can't they just assert their willpower, or why don't they just get out of that? And to the extent that it's reached a serious situation that's looking more like an addiction than just a mere problem, what I always say is that we can say a person is responsible for the recovery, but let's be compassionate and not say they're responsible for their disease, if you will. So I want to talk a little bit more here about how this problem develops and how we can think perhaps more clearly about what's a problem versus what's an addiction and what kind of happens in between. The problem often starts in youth, and it's hypothesized that the course of the problem can be very lengthy, and so it can start with some sort of minor exposure and then build over time. The key stage where we need to have immediate intervention is at this initiation stage. So the common scenario, Bishop gave one example of mistyping on the internet. In days past, it was usually an older peer who would be exposing. What I'm hearing more and more now, it's really same-age peers. We have segments of our youth who are developing at different rates. So your fifth grader and my fifth grader may be very different in terms of how much they're exposed to the ways of the world. And parents do need to take the responsibility to monitor this and to intervene. I should note also that there's a misconception of there being an inevitable rite of passage, that some people will say, it's so prevalent, it's everywhere. Isn't this something everyone just has to go through? As Soren mentioned in the introduction, I've had the privilege throughout the last decade and a half of doing seminary evaluations and evaluations of people applying for religious life. And so I hear lots of histories of people. And it's not at all uncommon that there are youth who come through their adolescence, and yes, they may have been exposed to pornography or illicit material, but they took it upon themselves. They knew it was wrong. They went to their parents had the appropriate response, educated them, and they put it down and they never picked it up again. And I think that's an important message of hope, because I think it's easy to get discouraged and think that everyone's just going to get mired in this trap. But there are ways that it can be worked around. Those other stages, establishment, escalation, de-escalation, what I'll just highlight there is that the trajectory is not an even one, that people do pick this up and put it down, it gets worse. Again, because we're all made by God in His image, there's a natural instinct inside us that knows it's wrong, and so even people who are pushing into this will recoil at some point. They'll go over their own boundary of what they think is acceptable. They'll de-escalate. They'll escalate again. Eventually, usually it's either getting caught in a workplace or by a spouse or some situation where it gets to an acute stage that they'll enter treatment. But this can take years and years, and as I'll talk in a bit, throughout the course of those years, changes are happening in brain and development that make this even more complicated. From a professional standpoint, it's important to note, too, that there's not consensus on what to call this problem. So we hear it called an addiction, we hear it called dependency, we hear it called compulsive sexual behavior. There's a variety of definitions about. What I take from the range of explanations here is that there's a common core, and that is that the person makes sex a priority or sexual material priority. It becomes more important to them than the things that ought to be important to them, their family, their friends, their work, their productivity, and in some ways becomes an organizing principle in their life. And to the extent that that happens, I start to use the label of addiction or compulsivity to help the person understand that this has gone over a certain boundary. Carnes emphasizes that there's not one pattern of sex addiction, and the key is that whatever the characteristics are, that they have taken control over the person's life, and they're finding themselves doing things they wouldn't have dreamed of doing a year or two ago. I would also argue in some ways that the distinction between a problem and an addiction is maybe a false dichotomy. I think because of the way the brain chemistry begins to change and be involved, that a person who has a regular pattern of using pornography of any sort is really placing themselves at risk. The American Society of Addiction Medicine put forth this definition here you can read on the slide, and they expand on that to really highlight a few things. And so if someone's problem with pornography is growing and growing, it'll be characterized by things like the following: that they're unable to abstain from that even when they're making a strong effort to do so. So there's recurrence, there's abuse, there's relapses and things of this nature. The impairment of behavioral control. Again, most of us are fairly well in control of what we do, and we do what we want to do most of the time. People who are getting to a stage of addiction are finding themselves crossing their own boundaries. There's this craving or an increased hunger for the substance, or in this case, the activity. Most problematically, I think, is, and really a hallmark here, is there's a lessening in the ability to recognize significant problems with their behavior or in their relationships. So they're whittling away at the natural joy in life that comes from relating to other people, but they're unaware that this is happening. They're not seeing it. And then again, clinically and I imagine pastorally, we often get approached by the people around them, most commonly their wives, noting that there's something different, and there's a distress there, of course. And then the dysfunctional emotional responses. There's research that shows that men who are regularly viewing pornography are more quick to become angry and lose their temper. And part of that, I suspect, is a combination of things, one of which, though, is a feeling of guilt that the man has, and he's not dealing with it directly, and so there's an unsettledness and a distress, and instead of getting the help he needs, he's lashing out at others. While pornography is not a new phenomenon, over the past 2 decades, the harm has exploded because of the internet and this thing called the AAA engine. And I say this with the recognition that DVRs or VCRs and there's other ways that pornography has become more readily available. But there's a particular thing with the internet. And it's captured by the affordability aspect, that it's cheap and many times free. The accessibility, as I was saying before, you no longer need to go anywhere, have a human encounter to obtain pornography. And I think that's a key thing. I think what held a lot of people back from using pornography in the past was they didn't want to look in someone else's eyes and ask for it. There's a range of pornography, and we'll spare the details on that, but just be aware that this is an increasing problem, that people are, as they get more and more addicted, they're looking for more variety, and when you ask for more variety, unfortunately the industry's happy to provide that. And then the anonymity, again, with nobody knows or cares who you are, and people get seduced into more and more use. Along with these factors driving up the use, the mode of accessing and using pornography on the internet is impacting how our brains process the material. And this is complex in a certain way, but simply put, internet pornography has an impact on our neurological functioning. First, it impacts the mood and action brain chemicals. So dopamine and adrenaline each are impacted by pornography use. Secondly, it impacts our bonding and attachment hormones, oxytocin and vasopressin. So looking at pornography impacts how we see others, how we relate to others, how we attach to others, obviously in a negative way. And then it's also been found to have a negative impact on frontal lobe functioning. And the way it was described in one article was it results in what's called frantic learning. It's kind of akin, if you remember Psychology 101 and way back, the Skinner box and the rat's in there and he's pressing the lever trying to get to his reward. And if you just take the metaphor there, it's pretty direct that this, the pointing and clicking, the searching on the internet is remapping the brain in a similar way. And the reward of the sexual arousal is so strong that the brain is really tapping into that over and over. And again, it's known physiologically that sexual arousal, unlike things like food, doesn't satiate. That there's a way in which people don't get enough of it and then move on. There's this constant seeking of more and more. It's not to say there's not periods of abstinence or times of breaks, but there's a way in which it's erroneous to think that somehow you can expose people to enough pornography or enough sexuality that they're going to kind of become blasé about it. The natural mechanism is to always seek more and more. Soren mentioned my time at the Medical College of Georgia. One of the psychiatrists there told me a story how decades ago one of the faculty had the idea that to desensitize the psychiatry residents to the human body and discussions of sexuality, they would show them pornography and thinking that this exposure would kind of make them sort of more comfortable with the phenomena and able to talk about it and interact with patients more comfortably. And what they found, of course, is it didn't have that impact at all. It's not the kind of phenomena where you just need to kind of see it to appreciate it and then let it go. It's the kind of phenomena that is always calling the person for more and more. The second area I want to look at briefly is the cost to family and society, and this is possibly things that you're already aware of, but I think it's worth highlighting. Bishop lays out these costs in his letters, and the first I'll note is that the character of dating is shifting. More and more young people are exposed to pornographic material at earlier and earlier ages. It's difficult for them to understand what romantic relationships are as distinct from sexual relationships. And so they don't have a mature conception of emotional intimacies. And so children are at risk of failing to ever see and appreciate the beauty of God's gift of sexuality if their first encounter with it is mockery, superficial, distorted manner of pornographic material. Obviously, there's a huge impact on the family. It's the basic cell of society, and to the extent that pornography is taking men away from their families and from their wives, it's going to have a negative impact. Particularly parents need to understand that their experience when they were young of pornography and exposure is going to be quite different from their children's. The cost of business and industry are well documented, a lot of loss of productivity. And finally, society itself is harmed. The increase of risk of sexual deviance, sexual offenses, acceptance of rape myths, all these things are increased by people who find themselves mired in sexual addiction. In particular, I would note that the young women and the images and perspective they're given on what their bodies are like and what they're for is particularly tragic. I'm going to skip ahead here. The consequences of this span the domains I talked about before in terms of our emotional functioning, our behavioral functioning. I talked about the increased depression, anxiety, the behavioral consequences, again, I think are particularly important. Men who are getting mired in this in particular are neglecting their social, occupational, or other recreational activities. They spend an enormous amount of time obsessing about or trying to find pornographic material, then they spend time involved with it. And then there's also this time spent trying to recover from it, covering up, lying, secrets, work issues that might be a consequence of that. Obviously, there's the impact on the marriage. Many women, even if the man never physically involves himself with another woman, will justifiably see this as affair-like behavior, betrayal. The physiological process, just to say it in a different way, the frequent state of arousal that people attain through this activity has kind of an analgesic effect where the body is naturally releasing chemicals that fuel the addiction. And so they're having this mimicry of a positive sexual encounter without another person present. And it's particularly vicious in that way because what happens is that the person who's engaging in this will feel at a biochemical level like they're going to have this attachment encounter because of the use of the pornography and the masturbatory behavior that goes with it. But because there's not another person there, at the end of the day, they're not satisfied by that. And they either sink into a depression or more frequently they find it again through the same mechanism. And so it becomes very much a progressive problem, and it's not just a matter of the will. I want to finish here with the last couple parts, looking more towards what can be done to help here and to provide some hope. We as Catholics are a people of profound hope and don't need to be discouraged. I think Bishop was highlighting this as well in his introduction. We have the assurance that the victory has been won by Christ in the shedding of his blood for us, and we should always be mindful of this with confidence that the problems, no matter how severe, can be overcome, and that they're overcome by both spiritual, I think, and human formation. This idea that grace builds on nature. You'll see in Bishop's work, certainly talk with your local priests, and we'll look forward to Father Kokali's presentation for additional help on the spiritual side. What I want to talk on the natural level is the importance of accountability, boundaries, and relationships. Just have a graph up here. Again, the course of recovery is lengthy. That's the main point of showing you this slide. The problem develops over a long period of time. There are different crisis phases. But if you're going to be helping people through this problem, if people approach you, just be aware that in your supportive role, you're going to inevitably have a lot of ups and downs with the people that you're trying to help. And unlike something like a recovering alcoholic who can abstain from drinking for the rest of their lives, the goal with sexual addiction is more like the goal we have when we're working with someone who might have an eating disorder. One of the dilemmas with eating disorders is you can't tell people just to stop eating if obesity is the problem. They have to have a healthy manner of food intake. Similarly, someone with a sex addiction, it's not typically the goal to give up any sexual activity at all. It's to have a healthy sexual relationship and sexual appetite, and that's part of what makes it more complicated. So again, looking at the Christian view of the human person, and to understand how flourishing happens, we really want to consider all aspects of our nature, our bodily nature, our interpersonal nature, our cognitive ability to think, as well as our motivations. First, the focus and the dysfunction is occurring in the physical, emotional life where the person is entrapped. As a therapist, as a clinician, when we're trying to help people through this problem, we really first want to just put an end to the behavior itself. So we look for trying to put up barriers to interrupt the addiction cycle, to get the person out of seeking that temporary high or ecstasy that they know themselves. And when you talk to people who are mired in this, they're very aware that this temporary high inevitably ends up with emptiness, loneliness, boredom, and as I said before, even anger. that there's not a good outcome to this. Some people will come to this of their own volition. Other people have it pointed out by family and friends. This notion of accountability really brings in the interpersonal aspect, which I think, again, is really at the center of all of this, that the solution must involve healing in relationships. The way this problem developed was in a deficiency somehow in interpersonal relationships, but the person will need to break out of secrecy and somehow open up to other people as a way of resolving the problem. Prudence is important. We don't want people telling everyone about this problem, but no one resolves this problem on their own. So there's different ways accountability can become a part in terms of support groups, and oftentimes through a place like counseling or therapy. The third area there, the rational aspect, because of the amount of time people spend pursuing this and involved in it, they can end up with distorted thinking and ways of viewing the world that are just unhealthy and inaccurate. And so clarity is important, and oftentimes as a therapist, that'll be the nature of my interaction, is trying to help people sort through the distortions in their thinking about what this phenomena is about. And oftentimes they're thinking about it as just a sexual problem again, and they're not seeing the implications for their family and other relationships. And finally, because the dysfunction in our emotional life, our interpersonal life, and our way of thinking can all be a part of contributing to this problem, that all impacts our motivation and our will. The real hope comes from realizing that if we can begin to heal our emotions, heal our relationships, clarify our thinking, that we will, in fact, have more freedom to enact our will and to pursue things in a more godly manner. So in terms of a plan for healing, there was a dissertation done back in 2008 at a Christian university named Assessing Recovery Tools for Use by the Church in Helping Male Users of Pornography. And this dissertation concluded that there were really three prongs to the effort: psychotherapy, 12-step programs, and Christian spirituality. I would add the importance of additional interpersonal relationships of a variety of sorts. I think the idea of having accountability partners is really critical. If a man is able to identify a friend who's going to monitor his internet use in a certain way, that goes a long way to curbing the problem. But I'd also highlight people who are available who may not even know of the pornography problem per se, but can provide fellowship and companionship. Again, looking at the problem for men, they need go-to guys where they can just have what you might think of just normal social interactions around other things and fill their lives with opportunities that will fill them with good things and not have them as tempted by the feelings of loneliness or boredom. Or even if there are marital problems, they'll have a place to discuss these rather than seeking refuge in the escape of pornography. I'll skip over this briefly. There's just this idea of first and second order change. What I'm going to highlight, and we can do more discussion during the Q&A if you're interested, is that it's simply important with a problem like this, as with any addiction, is to put the substance down, get away from the activity that's fueling the addiction. There's lots of historical, interpersonal, perhaps traumatic work that needs to be done in a therapeutic situation, but none of that takes root if the person is still using or abusing the pornography or sexual activity. There's a variety of groups out there. Again, I think we have resources in your packet. You can look at these. But what groups do very profoundly is get past the level of the secret. And so it's no longer something that people can hide from. They have to expose it to people who understand their difficulty and people who are going to have a compassionate response. With the counseling and therapy enterprise, what we also look at is, are there ways to improve a person's way of thinking? There's a number of tasks. Again, we don't have time to go into them in detail, but there are techniques available that really challenge a person to look more clearly at what they've been doing, why they've been doing it, and also to put some preventions in place. Just briefly, this idea of writing a letter to themselves. It's something that when they're feeling confident and strong and wanting to beat this problem, they write themselves a letter. And if they're ever at a point of choice of I'm going to act out, they pull out this letter where they lay out all of what they think about themselves in a positive, affirming way of why they should keep on the path to sobriety. Again, I'd be remiss not to mention just briefly that there's an impact and a role for spouses. Spouses are profoundly wounded by this. Our human sexuality, that relationship touches people at the most vital core of who they are. And so there's a very important sensitivity to dealing with this. The issue of disclosure, again, we can take up in Q&A if people are interested in hearing more discussion about that. But it's not entirely obvious the best way to go about this. And there are some things that we can explore about why it's so important that this is dealt with in both a transparent and authentic way, but also a way that has a lot of prudence and discretion about what gets disclosed. We don't want to re-injure spouses any more than they've been injured. We also don't want to leave things in hiding. And so there's a delicate balance there to be struck. So there's processes that have been developed in terms of how you restore trust in a relationship, how you have a spouse stay in the battle with their addicted spouse to help see them through. Over time, attitudes and approaches shift, and in the end, the marriage can actually be enhanced to be better than it had been before. And then finally, quick fix guidelines here. Just a few things. Again, when people may approach you and are saying kind of what's the first step? What do I do to deal with this? Someone approaches you. There's really this idea of a zero tolerance sort of phenomena that our society is saturated with sexuality. We can't avoid it entirely, so that person has to take responsibility for avoiding it as best they can in their own world. And sometimes this means turning off machines, getting rid of internet service. Number 3, they're telling a friend or a group. I think it's, again, once the secret is out there, people can be very encouraged if they've been choosing the right people to tell, to seek for support. There's a lot of monitoring software out there, ways that very subtly, but again, in a non-private way, people are being able to be assisted in being accountable for their behavior and not have everything happening in secret. And looking, oneself in the mirror in a very stark way and saying, what am I thinking here? How am I distorting? How am I justifying this behavior? Oftentimes, clinically, you'll just hear the story that people don't go from a place of sobriety to addiction in one step. They just start making excuses, and it's the magazine at the checkout counter, well, that's not so bad. The sports magazine, well, that's not so bad. And it's a very slippery slope that people find themselves getting into. I'll wrap up here. There's, again, a lot of resources. I know Soren's put together a packet where you can locate those, and be happy to address any follow-up questions during our Q&A. Thank you.
I'd like to propose, thank you, Dr. Moncher, we take some time for a Q&A and feedback and comments, and then move to a break, and then for Father Sean's presentation. So why don't we take a time here for any questions for Dr. Moncher that have arisen as you've heard this morning's presentation? Yes. And we've got a microphone there. Maybe Sean, if you could.
Would you be able to comment on either behavioral or pastoral or guidelines related to 50 Shades of Grey. It's kind of a new phenomenon in that it's more mainstream, kind of out of the closet, and involves women more than men. And I'd like to understand your perspective on that as an entry point, as well as things that we pastorally can do related to it.
Well, I'm happy to say I'm not very familiar with 50 Shades of Grey. I know about as much as Bishop shared, just what's showing up in the headlines. I think there's a couple of things there. One is, as you say, it's targeting more women than men. And that, I would say, is just a sad commentary on the direction things are headed with this problem. It's getting worse, not better. For a long time, women, were the holders of virtue in a certain sense, and I don't know if that was always entirely fair, but there was a goodness to that. And to the extent that women are beginning to think that this sort of thing is more acceptable, I think we're confronting a starker problem. And again, particularly for the young women, if this is the message they're getting, that somehow what is normal or what is good or what is, I guess in the old language, what is cool is to be more like men in this way. I think it's very, very problematic. So I'll go back to that phrase, zero tolerance. I think from both the clinical and pastoral perspective, I think if a client of mine or a friend of my wife were to ask sort of, do you see a problem with me reading this material or seeing this movie, I would encourage them really to look at, what would be the point? What are you really seeking there? What are you trying to, what's going to enhance your life about this? And so I think, we've got to deal with what's presented us. I don't think we can avoid it. But for those who are open to hearing the idea that, there are certain things that really are destructive to your dignity, and it's going to compromise you. It's going to compromise your ability to be the best wife and mother you can be, if this is what you're filling your mind with and your visual field with. Perhaps that can be a good message to put forward. To the extent that it's in the bookstores and in the libraries, I think people will be approaching us and kind of wondering what we think about it. Other question? Mm-hmm.
Hi, could you comment several slides back about the prenatal and postnatal impact when you were talking about multiple pathways that pornography finds its way into people's lives? Yeah. So it was the slide about bodily, interpersonal, volitional, cognitive.
Right, yeah. And what I was referring there was kind of more generally speaking about the development of the human person, not about kind of anything of the impact of pornography itself. But I think what's involved in our bodily development in that aspect of us as a human person, I think sometimes people can think very discreetly about just sort of our physiology. And what I think is important to understand about how God made us is that the development begins not only with the genetic makeup that He gave us from our parents, but also anything that happens prenatally or immediately postnatally. These all are psychologically relevant variables, and I think people sometimes don't understand how significant those can be. And it's just a message of how it's important to be vigilant as we grow our families and as we guide families, that it does matter how you care for yourself and your children from very early on. Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
You touched very briefly about saying that you were involved in, I guess, the psychological evaluations for seminarians. Mm-hmm. You have been. When you see an evaluation where a young man has had an issue with pornography,
Right.
but it's maybe he's gotten help or it's under control or what have you. Do you see that as a red flag moving forward for the man?
It depends a good bit on the length of exposure as well as the length of what we call sobriety. So it's certainly a red flag of sorts. With the sexualization of society, like I said, it's rare to meet a 20-year-old who hasn't been exposed to this at all. And so the exposure is going to be there. What's most important is what they did with that initial exposure. And when I'm working with someone clinically and doing this evaluation, if they're telling me something of the nature, for example, that between the ages of 14 or 16 I was pretty involved, but then at my confirmation or whatever, I kind of really got it and how bad or wrong or sinful it is. There's still, unfortunately, even in our church and in practicing Catholic families, the message isn't always getting communicated that things like masturbation are sinful. And so sometimes men or young boys are unaware of this, and when they become aware of it, then they take a different attitude towards it. And then if they've had several years of no exposure to pornography use and maintaining continence and their and chastity, then I don't see that red flag as something that's prohibitive to them moving forward. In contrast, I've also evaluated men who have had a problem and they're saying, yeah, it's been better over the last couple months, but they're really wanting to enter seminary or religious life, and that's a little bit of a different story. Different dioceses and different religious orders, I think, have their own internal decision-making around those factors. But from a psychological perspective, I think it's unlikely that someone who's having a persistent problem and hasn't achieved a degree of continence in their life is going to automatically experience that. The more common trajectory is during the first year of formation, during the novitiate, because of a multiple number of factors, both natural and supernatural, things go well. And then it's the year after and the year after where the problem returns. And I think that's the problem we really wrestle with, is how do we do our best to both encourage men to be ready before they enter so that they don't have that relapse. But there will still be cases where people do relapse, and then what can we bring to bear to help them through that phase as well?
Just like alcoholics, they always have recovery. Alcoholics, they're always recovering.
Right, always in a recovery stance, and this is where the zero tolerance comes in. I think it's it's one of these mental gymnastics people easily play on themselves, that they can just sort of dabble a little, and pornography is one of those things where I think dabbling is dangerous.
It seems that there are a growing number of studies, thank you, that are looking at this building epidemic of a distortion of body image, not only among men and women, but even adolescents and pre-adolescents as well. Can you offer any perspective on the relation between that and the culture of pornography? Because it seems that it's just creating such this tangled web, and how to kind of separate and help, and especially the pre-adolescents. I was just recently reading a study that was looking at I can't remember the statistic, but it was a horrifically high number of pre-adolescents that were at a healthy body weight that either considered themselves too thin or too fat.
Yeah, no, I think you're describing it well. There is, I think it has everything to do with, if not pornography per se, the objectification of women. So, where you draw the line on what's pornographic and what's not. But very clearly to me, the way people are portrayed in the media with all the, what do they call it, airbrushing or whatever that goes on, that there's just an unrealistic standard for what is acceptable and what is beauty. And I think that's where the church really needs to kind of hold forth about the dignity of the human person. God made us each who we are. We weren't made to be whoever's on the cover of the magazine. And until we're able to communicate to our young people that they are created to be who they are, not to strive for some mythical ideal that the media is putting forth, I think we're going to see more and more of this difficulty. And you're right, it's getting younger and younger. the toys that are being marketed and even the cartoons that are being put out to young people are, I think, very unrealistic in what they portray.
Any other questions?
You know, though, on her subject there, when I was a kid, I mean, there was Barbie dolls, and there were all of those types of things, Marilyn Monroe's and all that, and somehow we didn't twist it. I don't think like it's getting twisted today. Am I wrong?
Well, I would say it was the beginning of twisting. I think I think it's a little bit the frog in the water. You know, if you put a frog in water and you turn up the heat and you boil it, it won't jump out. It'll just stay and die. It's that kind of process where it was beginning, but it wasn't rampant. It was subtle. We still lived in a more Christian culture back then, where the boundaries were clear, and if people were pushing the boundaries, everyone knew they were pushing the boundaries, and people would call them on it. What's happened over the last 30, 40 years is people are beginning to normalize and act in an accepting way towards things that certainly, I'm sure my parents and certainly my grandparents would just be appalled and just shocked by what's passing for normal, acceptable.
Something's happened though somewhere. I don't know where I'm going with this, but like when I was a kid, we played cowboys and Indians, and we shot each other and we tied each other up. Did we grow up to be the ones that were doing all this slaughtering? No, it's the younger generation kids that are coming into the world today that have gotten twisted. So, and I don't think our playing cowboys and Indians with kids had anything to do with what's happening today. Like I don't think the Barbie has anything to do with what's happening today. Somehow it's gotten twisted, and I don't know where it's at.
And it would be bold of me to say I knew the answer to that. My knee-jerk reaction would be that it's about relationship. That what was different 40 years ago was that technology wasn't as fast and readily available, and so when you're playing cowboys and Indians and spending time with each other, you're spending time with each other, and you're going home to mom and dad and you're spending time with them. I think what happens now is people, if kids are playing cowboys and Indians, they're not going home and having face-to-face time with mom and dad and nurturing, affirming relationships. They're turning on an iPad and shooting people there too. And so it's the shift in how relationships are treated is, I think, a very powerful factor in all this. And I don't know how we recover until we begin to value real FaceTime, not the kind on the phone, but the one-on-one, sitting in the living room, looking at each other, spending time together.
Yeah, I would just add on that. Kids today aren't even playing cowboys and Indians. And I mean, that's one of the problems, is that they're not establishing good friendships. They're not spending time really with their peers even, because everything's happening through an electronic device or video games. Like playing cowboys and Indians consists of an internet connection with an Xbox, talking to people they don't even know. And when I was growing up, we had one TV in the house. We had one car, which meant there was always somebody home. Today, everybody has their own cars, TVs in every room, and just communication in general in the family is breaking down. And the media is it's really different. You know, we had Barbie dolls growing up, but kids, they have Bratz dolls. Have you ever seen a Bratz doll? A Bratz doll is like a little porn star. It's basically what it looks like, more or less. And if you watch Justice League today, the body types of the superheroes, totally different than the Super Friends. You know, the Super Friends actually had superpowers, so they didn't need all these muscles and obscure like body types. But today, superheroes are drawn very specifically to accentuate body type, you know, which probably goes back to that body type question from earlier. So during my presentation, I'm going to talk a lot about relationship and really root everything in the family. And so hopefully it'll give us some more to reflect on in that area. Thanks.